She was 21, pregnant, and glowing at her baby shower, until her own father walked in with a gift box and opened fire. One man died instantly. His blood soaked the confetti. And by the time the screaming stopped, the woman carrying the unborn child was lying face down next to her cake. What made a father bring a gun to his daughter's baby shower? Why did her mother just stand there, frozen? And what was in the voice note he received just hours before the shooting? The answers unravel a family twisted by betrayal, a mother's silence bought with promises, and a secret the daughter kept buried until the day she couldn't anymore. This wasn't just a family scandal. This was something darker. And by the time justice came, the only innocent person was already gone. It was supposed to be a celebration. The backyard was draped in pastel blue and white streamers, with guests swaying to soft R&B and laughter bubbling around a table stacked with diaper cakes and gift bags. Imani Carver stood near the center, belly round, cheeks glowing, snapping photos with her best friend and greeting relatives she hadn't seen in years. For a 21-year-old preparing to welcome her first child, it was the kind of moment people remembered forever. Just not like this. Witnesses said they noticed him walking in late, alone, dressed in a gray button-down, holding a silver gift box under his arm. Some knew who he was. Others didn't. But no one asked questions. He was her father. Malik Carver walked slowly, not smiling, not speaking. One woman recalled him barely glancing at the decorations as he stepped past the buffet table and into the crowd. Imani noticed him a few feet away and waved. He didn't wave back. Then it happened. In a matter of seconds, screams pierced the backyard. The sound of the first gunshot froze the crowd. The second made people run. Someone yelled, "He's got a gun!" But it came too late. Zaire Morgan, the man who had been standing inches from Imani, hit the ground before anyone could process what they were seeing. The gift box was gone. In Malik's hands now was a black handgun, already smoking. People ran, knocking over tables, grabbing their children. Balloons popped beneath panicked feet. Some guests dove behind chairs or into the house. A few dropped to the grass in shock. No one expected what came next. Tanisha Ellington, standing just feet away, locked eyes with her ex-husband. Her scream was drowned out by the third shot. Imani lunged, no one sure why, not in that moment, but she stepped into the line of fire. Her body dropped before her mother could react. Face down, just inches from her own baby shower cake. Sirens wailed in the distance as the screaming continued. Someone had already called 911. By the time the first officers arrived, Malik had dropped the gun and walked toward the driveway with his hands in the air. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just waited to be cuffed. Inside the yard, paramedics worked in silence. Zaire was declared dead at the scene. Imani still had a pulse when they loaded her into the ambulance, but she wouldn't make it to the hospital. The blue balloons kept floating above it all like nothing had happened. Tanisha stood in place, trembling. Neighbors said she looked like she wasn't breathing. Someone tried to hold her, but she shrugged them off. She kept whispering the same thing to herself. Why would he do this? Why her? That was the question circling everyone's mind. Why had a father shown up at his daughter's baby shower with a gun disguised as a gift? Why had he aimed it at the man she was celebrating with? Why had he not stopped when she stood in the way? Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of what they saw, but one thing was consistent. Malik didn't say a single word. He came in, shot 2 people, and surrendered. Silent. Police later confirmed that the weapon had been concealed inside the gift box, which was lined with shredded tissue paper. They found 2 additional rounds still in the magazine. The guests, some of whom had just finished playing games minutes before, were now giving statements through tears. But no one had any idea what really led to that moment. Not yet. The only certainty was that a baby shower had ended with 2 bodies on the ground. And the only person who might have stopped it was the one who died trying. Malik Carver had been a quiet man, not passive, but measured. He married Tanisha Ellington in his late 20s. They met through a mutual friend in Charlotte and built a modest life together. A 2-bedroom townhouse, shared car, and eventually, one daughter, Imani. She was born during the summer of Malik's promotion at work. He swore she was the best thing that ever happened to him. For the first 12 years, things looked picture-perfect from the outside. But Tanisha wanted more. Not in a reckless, wild kind of way, just more. More attention, more money, more admiration. And when she started staying out later, dressing sharper, Malik didn't argue. He asked questions, got short answers, and stayed silent. Until the night everything broke. The call came from a longtime friend of his, someone who managed a hotel about 30 minutes outside the city. The message was simple: "She's been here a few times. You might want to come see for yourself." Malik didn't respond. He got in the car and drove. When he walked into the hotel lobby, he didn't make a scene. He stood near the entrance, waiting. Then he saw her. Tanisha was in the lounge area, sitting beside a man in a suit. They weren't hiding. They were laughing. His hand was on her thigh. At one point they kissed, a long, slow kiss, as they waited for their room to be ready. That was the moment she saw him. Their eyes locked across the room. Malik didn't say a word. He didn't approach. He didn't ask questions. He turned around and walked out. By the time Tanisha got home 3 days later, Malik had already filed for divorce. There was no shouting match, no revenge plan. Just a cold wall that had come down for good. He moved into a small apartment on the east side of town, split their assets as cleanly as the court allowed, and quietly requested joint custody of Imani. But that didn't go his way. Tanisha pushed for full custody and won. Her attorney painted Malik as emotionally distant and financially unstable, a man whose schedule didn't allow him time to raise a child. The judge agreed. Malik was granted visitation rights, but it wasn't the outcome he hoped for. Still, he never disappeared. Every week, like clockwork, he called. He showed up for birthdays. He bought her favorite books, taught her how to braid her hair, and drove 2 hours in a rainstorm just to see her perform in a school play. He never missed a call, never forgot a date. To Imani, he was still dad, the only one who didn't ask her to change, who didn't make her feel like a burden. Their bond was different. Quiet but firm. She told friends she preferred weekends with him because he lets me breathe. And though Tanisha allowed the contact, she didn't encourage it. Over time, her new life with Zaire Morgan took center stage. Malik noticed the change but never pressed. He just kept showing up, like always. No one could say he was perfect, but no one could say he didn't love his daughter. So when that voice note arrived years later, filled with trembling words and confessions no father should hear, something inside him cracked. But before that moment ever came, Malik had already lost his marriage, his home, and his daughter's everyday life. What he refused to lose was her trust. And until the day of the baby shower, he believed he still had it. Tanisha Ellington never offered a real explanation, not to Malik, not to Imani, and not to the people who thought they knew her. One day, she was a divorcee trying to restart her life. The next, she was living in Charlotte with a new man, acting like the past never existed. Her shift didn't come with an announcement. It came like most quiet storms, suddenly and without apology. Zaire Morgan was the kind of man who knew how to impress. Mid-40s, owned a local car lot, and always seemed to have cash on hand. He wore watches that caught the light and drove a black Charger that never needed washing. When he met Tanisha at a lounge through mutual acquaintances, he didn't waste time. Within a month, he'd paid her rent, upgraded her phone, and given her the kind of attention she hadn't felt in years. Malik had been dependable. Zaire was magnetic. But her decision to move in with him wasn't just about attraction, it was about survival. Tanisha had never quite let go of her mother's voice. Her mother, a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her soft heart, had always said the same thing. You can marry a poor man, but don't stay poor. His insurance better be your retirement plan. That thinking had shaped Tanisha for years. Love was nice, but it didn't pay bills. Security wasn't about emotional consistency, it was about bank statements. So when Zaire promised her not just comfort, but a future business and a slice of his life insurance policy, she didn't hesitate. He told her he was cutting off his estranged adult son and wanted her to be listed instead. She believed him. She told friends she was building something new. What she didn't say was how much of it depended on the promises Zaire made behind closed doors. He said he'd co-sign a salon for her. He said she could be listed as the primary beneficiary. He said everything Malik never did, and whether or not it was true didn't matter to Tanisha. It was enough to anchor herself to a new man without looking back. Imani was 17 when they moved to Charlotte. It wasn't a conversation. It was a decision Tanisha made, and Imani followed. Malik wasn't even informed until days later. By the time he found out, they were already gone. At first, Imani tried to adjust. She told herself it was temporary. But Charlotte wasn't familiar. The new apartment felt like someone else's home, and Zaire's presence was heavy from the beginning. He watched everything. Where she went, who she talked to, what she wore. Tanisha said he was just protective. Imani knew it was something else. But when she expressed discomfort, her mother brushed it off. You're just not used to men stepping up, she said. He actually cares. Over time, Imani stopped talking. She became quieter, spent more time in her room, and texted Malik more often than she let on. But even he didn't know how deep the unease ran. He only saw the smiles she forced on video calls and heard the politeness in her voice. He didn't see the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Tanisha's dependence on Zaire deepened. She quit her part-time job, started researching salon equipment online, and began using Zaire's debit card without asking. The promises felt real. Her life was tied to his money, his plans, and the idea that she was finally being chosen after years of feeling overlooked. But in choosing a man who offered more, she ignored everything he was hiding. And in moving forward without explanation, she left Imani trapped between silence and survival, without fully knowing the cost. By the time Imani turned 18, her relationship with Zaire Morgan had shifted into something she couldn't name, but could feel. He started with compliments. Not the kind you expect from someone dating your mom, but the kind that clung a little too long in the air. You're really growing into yourself, he'd say, or, you got your mama's figure, but your own kind of fine. He made those comments when Tanisha wasn't around. The first physical contact came days later. It turned out they got intimate just in the living room, as Zaire would later confess. Imani told Tanisha the next day. Sat her down in the living room and tried to explain what happened. The response was ice cold. Imani didn't push again. She saw the wall in her mother's eyes. She knew this wasn't confusion. This was denial dressed in comfort. Tanisha didn't stop there. She made a phone call. Later that week, Zuri Banks came by, unannounced. Imani's best friend. Imani had always trusted Zuri Banks. They'd grown up on the same block, shared clothes in high school, and stayed close even after the move to Charlotte. Zuri was one of the few people Imani still confided in after her life became quieter, smaller, and more confusing under the weight of Zaire Morgan's presence. So when Zuri started visiting more frequently around Imani's 18th birthday, it didn't feel suspicious. It felt like support. Imani had just confided in her mother about Zaire's behavior, only to be met with silence and subtle dismissal. Zuri showing up days later felt like a lifeline. But what Imani didn't know was that those visits weren't random. They were arranged. Tanisha's mother had quietly paid Zuri, cash handed off in person, to visit Imani and help shift her perspective. The goal wasn't to encourage healing. It was to convince her that the lines had blurred, that what happened with Zaire wasn't wrong, and that she should see it as attention, not abuse. According to later investigation notes, the payment was modest, under $1,000, but the impact would echo far beyond the transaction. Zuri complied. She began subtly rewording Imani's experiences. She framed Zaire's actions as interest, not violation. She suggested that older men noticed value others missed. She painted submission as maturity. And in the background, she reinforced the idea that resistance would only make things harder for Imani in the home. The strategy worked, at least temporarily. Imani began retreating inward. She stopped asking questions. She kept to herself. Her daily routines grew mechanical. She avoided her father's calls more often and gave short answers when they spoke. Whatever had broken inside her was no longer being fought. It was being absorbed. But the illusion wouldn't last. Months later, the collapse came, not from Zaire or Tanisha, but from Zuri herself. Imani found out the truth by accident. Zaire had left his other phone on the kitchen counter while taking a call outside. A notification lit up the screen. It was a photo, nothing explicit, but unmistakably personal, sent from Zuri. The caption was brief but suggestive. It wasn't a one-time message. It was part of a thread. In a series of images, texts, and confirmations, Imani uncovered what had been happening behind her back. Zuri had not only convinced her to tolerate the abuse, she had also been participating in it. She wasn't a messenger. She was another recipient. Zaire had been sleeping with both of them. The timeline was unclear, but the deception was undeniable. Zuri had betrayed her for money first, and later, for personal gain. Imani didn't confront anyone. She didn't speak on it. She deleted every photo of Zuri on her phone. She unfollowed her on social media. She stopped responding to messages. And from that point forward, Imani's behavior shifted into something colder, harder. Friends later described her as detached. Whatever emotional ground she had left to stand on was gone. It wasn't just about the abuse anymore. It was about the layers of betrayal, from a mother who refused to protect her, from a grandmother who paid for her silence, and from a best friend who sold access and loyalty to the same man who had taken everything. Zaire, meanwhile, remained untouchable in the household. He was still the provider, still promising a future salon, still whispering control behind smiles and flattery. By the time Imani Carver turned 19, her silence had become part of the house. But behind that stillness were mounting scars, some visible only to her. Among them were 2 pregnancies, both terminated, both hidden from the one person who might have cared enough to stop everything, her father. The first pregnancy came just 6 months after the initial violation. She hadn't told anyone until the symptoms became impossible to ignore. She'd kept it hidden until she could no longer convince herself it was stress. She didn't have the money to go to a clinic alone. Zaire took control immediately. He booked the appointment, drove her there, waited in the car. Tanisha never asked where they were going that day. She never looked at the receipt from the pharmacy bag Imani brought back with her. She didn't ask why her daughter spent the next 48 hours curled up in bed. And when Zaire handed her cash the next morning and mentioned their future business, she nodded and said nothing. The second pregnancy happened the following year. This time, Zaire's tone shifted. He wasn't as calm. He accused Imani of not taking care of herself, of being careless. But once again, he arranged everything. The clinic, the aftercare, the silence. And again, Tanisha looked the other way. According to later statements gathered in interviews, Zaire had made a clear promise during that time. Once Imani turned 21, the salon would launch. Tanisha's name would be attached to the lease. Her name would also replace his son's on the life insurance policy. Those promises became her motivation. Not her daughter's safety. Not her well-being. But opportunity. And so when Imani began expressing a desire to move out, to get her own space, start a life outside that apartment, Zaire stepped in. Subtly at first, he warned her about bills, about how hard it would be without help. Then more directly, he told Tanisha she needed to talk to her daughter. Remind her how much she owed them. Tanisha did as told. Imani's efforts to leave were stalled every time. If she mentioned moving out, Tanisha reminded her of the rent she didn't pay. If she brought up college, Zaire claimed it wasn't the right time. When she applied for a job at a cafe 2 blocks away, her application mysteriously disappeared before the interview. She wasn't trapped with chains. She was trapped with dependence and manipulation. The message came through at 10:23 p.m. Malik Carver had just returned from a late shift when the notification buzzed on his phone. It was from Imani. His daughter rarely sent voice notes. She preferred texts, short updates, one-word replies. But this one was different. The timestamp read over 9 minutes. He sat down and pressed play. What followed was not a daughter reaching out to say hello. It was a confession, raw, trembling, and controlled only by the need to be heard. Imani spoke slowly, as if every sentence cost her something. She began by apologizing, for waiting too long, for not trusting him with the truth sooner, and for the shame she had carried in silence. But shame was no longer her priority. Survival had given way to honesty. She named Zaire Morgan first. She didn't describe just one moment, she outlined a pattern. The subtle manipulation, the first time he touched her, the pregnancies and the abortions. She explained how he kept her in the house, blocked her attempts to find work, and promised her mother things in exchange for silence. She detailed how the abuse wasn't hidden from Tanisha, but enabled by her. Then came Zuri. Imani explained how the one person she thought she could lean on had become part of the cycle. She didn't cry during the message. Her voice cracked only once, when she said she was tired. Not physically. Not emotionally. Just tired of pretending that nothing had happened. She ended the voice note with a sentence that would echo in Malik's head long after she was gone. If something happens to me, I need you to know it was never random. There was no call for help. No request for him to step in. Only the facts. And with them, a slow goodbye. Malik didn't reply. He didn't call back. Neighbors would later recall seeing him leave the apartment the next morning without saying much. He stopped by a small hardware store on the edge of town. Surveillance footage confirmed he paid cash. He walked out with a plain silver gift box, tissue paper, and a roll of ribbon. The gun he used had been registered in his name for over a decade. A gift from his brother, long locked away in a case beneath his bed. That day he loaded it carefully, wrapped it inside the box, and placed it on the passenger seat. There was no note. No manifesto. Just a quiet decision made in the absence of justice. He didn't text Imani to say he was coming to the baby shower. He already knew the date. She had mentioned it weeks earlier in passing, assuming he wouldn't show. He hadn't planned to. Until now. There were no alarms raised. No one expected anything. Malik had always been calm, composed. If he was spiraling, he did it in silence. The drive to the shower was uneventful. No stops. No hesitations. But inside the box, beneath the shredded paper and decorative bow, was a 9mm handgun. Loaded. That voice note didn't just expose what had happened. It turned a grieving father into a man with nothing left to lose. By the time police arrived, the backyard was a scene of shattered joy and frozen disbelief. Blue and white balloons still bobbed gently in the summer air, but the atmosphere had turned thick with panic. Guests huddled against the fence, some holding children, others covering their mouths in shock. 2 bodies lay on the grass, one motionless, the other barely clinging to life as paramedics fought to stabilize her. Malik Carver had not run. Witnesses described him walking calmly to the driveway, placing the handgun on the hood of a parked car, and raising his hands before the first responding officer even gave an order. He was arrested on the spot without resistance. Handcuffed, searched, and seated in the back of a cruiser before many inside the yard had even processed what they'd seen. The gift box that had concealed the weapon was recovered and photographed immediately. The lid had been peeled back cleanly. Beneath the tissue paper lay residue, traces of gunpowder, fragments of ribbon. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the weapon used matched the bullets found in both victims, and the remaining rounds in the magazine were consistent with those registered to Malik's firearm. Inside the house, guests were moved one by one for questioning. No one disputed what happened. Nearly 24 witnesses had seen Malik arrive, walk through the gathering with the gift box in hand, and shoot Zaire Morgan at close range. The second shot, striking Imani, had been less clear. Most recalled hearing screams, seeing movement, and realizing too late that she had stepped into the line of fire. Zuri Banks, however, had collapsed before officers even reached her. She had been standing near the cake table, just feet from Imani when the gun went off. According to responders, she vomited shortly after the second shot and was found sobbing behind the shed. She was the first non-family member taken for formal questioning. It was during that interview, conducted hours later at the station, that Zuri cracked. Audio transcripts from the session reveal a chaotic mix of guilt, panic, and admission. She confirmed the ongoing relationship between herself and Zaire, stating that it had started a while back, though she failed to specify how long. When asked why she never told Imani, she broke down again, stating that she didn't think it would end like this. But what sealed her credibility wasn't just her tears, it was what she brought forward. Zuri offered up the phone messages voluntarily. She gave detectives access to her device, where several months' worth of explicit exchanges between herself and Zaire were uncovered. Photos, texts, and calendar entries tied her to him in ways she couldn't explain away. She also admitted to receiving money from Tanisha's mother to ease Imani's fears and normalize Zaire's behavior. Meanwhile, Tanisha Ellington was held at the scene for preliminary questioning. Her statements were cautious. She denied any knowledge of Zaire's behavior toward Imani. She said she never suspected anything inappropriate. When confronted with questions about the salon promises and insurance plans, she offered vague responses, enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to arrest her outright. As investigators collected statements and secured evidence, one thing became clear: this was no random act of violence. It was the eruption of a long-silenced truth, one spoken too late, in a backyard full of people who had no idea what they were really celebrating. Imani Carver was laid to rest on a gray Thursday morning, beneath an overcast sky that seemed to understand the weight of the occasion. Her casket was white, trimmed with blue, and surrounded by flowers arranged by people who still couldn't say her name without trembling. The funeral was small, by choice, not by attendance. Most who showed up did so in quiet shock, unsure how to grieve a young woman whose life had ended in front of them, at her own baby shower, with a bullet meant for someone else. But as mourners gathered to say goodbye, the investigation was just beginning to take shape. In the days following the shooting, the voice note Imani had sent to her father became central to the unfolding case. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a full account. Detectives described it as a timeline, a confession, and a roadmap. The abuse, the manipulation, the financial motives, and the betrayal, it was all there. And most damning of all, it named every person involved. Tanisha Ellington was arrested 2 weeks after the funeral. What had initially appeared as emotional detachment was soon reframed as complicity. Phone records placed her in constant communication with both her mother and Zaire regarding Imani's daily activities. Bank statements showed recent transfers from Zaire to a newly opened account in Tanisha's name, directly correlating with dates Imani had attempted to apply for housing assistance. And the voice note confirmed she had knowledge of Zaire's actions, and chose to remain silent. The charges filed were specific: criminal conspiracy, endangering the welfare of a dependent adult, and failure to protect. Though she hadn't pulled the trigger, her role in suppressing the truth and enabling the harm was clear. The financial promises Zaire had made were laid bare through documents recovered from the apartment, incomplete lease agreements for a salon, unsigned insurance beneficiary forms, and handwritten notes detailing investment splits. It wasn't a dream. It was a transaction. Zuri Banks accepted a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation. She admitted to accepting money from Tanisha's mother and acknowledged the sexual relationship with Zaire. The prosecution viewed her as a secondary figure, a young woman used as a buffer between Imani and the truth. She was sentenced to probation and community supervision, with mandatory counseling. Her public apology was brief, and for many, insufficient. Malik Carver, charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and unlawful possession of a firearm on private property, pleaded guilty to 1 count under a negotiated sentence. His legal team submitted the voice note as evidence of psychological distress, which, while not a defense, was considered during sentencing. The judge acknowledged the emotional weight of the case but emphasized that vigilante justice could not be normalized. Malik received a 22-year prison sentence with eligibility for parole after 15. He did not appeal. Tanisha's trial ended with a conviction. Jurors cited Imani's voice note as undeniably clear, a damning piece of evidence that forced them to face the horror of a mother who allowed her daughter to suffer for personal gain. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison with no eligibility for early release. In the weeks that followed, there were no protests, no media frenzy, just silence. The home in Charlotte was cleared out, the lease terminated. Zaire's assets were seized and liquidated. The baby Imani had been carrying did not survive the shooting. Imani died trying to protect the same woman who allowed her to be used, convinced herself that silence was strategy, and called betrayal survival. She stepped into a bullet meant for someone who had already stepped away from her long ago. And in doing so, she became the only person in the story who chose to do the right thing.